Welcome to Close Readings, this the latest instalment in a series we are calling Love and Death, in which we are looking at the great tradition of elegiac poetry written in English from the Renaissance to the present day. My name is Seamus Perry and I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford. I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic and Professor of English at University College, London. And our subject today is a little sort of subgenre within elegy, isn't it, Mark? It's the elegy written for a dead poet. So these are poems about dead poets, and I suppose almost necessarily they are poems as much about the author's self-scrutiny and self-analysis as they are about grief. We'll go on to look at W.H. Auden's great elegy for the Irish poet Yeats, and then we'll end with a delightful poem written by James Schuyler about Auden. But we begin with one of the classics of this subgenre, Matthew Arnold's poem in memory of his friend Arthur Hugh Clough. And the poem is called Thyrsis, which is an odd title, which we can come back to in a moment. But first, I suppose we ought to say something about Clough, who he was, and what his relationship was with Matthew Arnold.
Well, they were at school together. They met at rugby, didn't they, where the headmaster was Thomas Arnold,
Matthew's dad.
Matthew's father. So he was a fairly forbidding figure in lots of ways. Clough was 4 years older, but they both belonged to that public school educated, extremely gifted, mid-Victorian young men who went on to Oxford and were committed to an idea of poetry when poetry was in a state of sort of semi-crisis, you might say, that the kind of great visionary powers of Romanticism had ebbed. And there's much dilemma in the work of both Clough and Arnold about what poets should be like. You know, should they be pastoral poets? And Thyrsis is predominantly a pastoral poem, but it's a pastoral poem that's so self-consciously aware of its genre, of its pastoralism, that it's using it almost as code rather than a belief in the kind of attempt to present the countryside. But Clough was a much more sceptical poet, wasn't he? That his poetry was much closer to novels in some ways. Amour de Voyage is a terrifically prosaic poem. And what's interesting, I think, is that they didn't like each other's poetry.
No, that's quite right.
They were good friends, but they didn't like the kinds of poetry that the other one wrote.
Matthew Arnold's taste is much more old-fashioned. You're quite right about that. And Clough, as you say, thinks that poetry should sort of modernise itself and recognise that it's living in an age where people really want to go out and read things like Vanity Fair or Bleak House or novels of the Brontes or whatever it might be. And Arnold is very resistant to that, as indeed he's not massively in tune with the novel as a genre at all.
Amour de Voyage is a sort of comedy of manners in some ways, and so is the Bothy of Tuber Wolich, which is again a very funny long poem. And I think what's interesting about all these three poems is they're not at all idealising of their subjects.
No.
They're not at all hagiographical. In fact, Thyrsis is rather rude about Clough in lots of ways and could be seen as a bit of a travesty of Clough's great genius and of his life. He's presented as a quick despairer, someone who gives up too easily.
Yeah.
Somehow he's racked by his unbelief, by his scepticism. He had to leave Oxford because he didn't subscribe to the 39 Articles. He had a fellowship at Oriel. So he was a scrupulous, conscientious person, but Arnold thought his conscientiousness was morbid, to use his phrase, and that somehow he was overdoing it, and that his scepticism had ruined his poetic gift. Whereas to us, Clough's scepticism is what makes him so interesting.
Yes, so let's say something a little bit about Clough. He's a star pupil, isn't he, at rugby? And everyone at Balliol, where he is a student with Arnold, is convinced he's going to be a tremendous success. I don't think anyone thinks Arnold's going to be a tremendous academic success because Arnold's been such a flighty and sort of flamboyant student. But Clough seems to have all the credentials that are required. And then to everyone's astonishment, he gets a second-class degree rather than the first-class degree. So there's a kind of an odd mixture of extraordinary promise, but also disappointment that's sort of built into the Clough myth from the very, very beginning. Then, as you say, he gets a fellowship at Oriel, and he works away at that until in 1848 he simply cannot, in good conscience, continue in that fellowship because it requires you to subscribe to the Articles of the Church of England, and he can't do that.
So he comes to UCL, University College London, where...
Well, first of all, he goes to Europe.
Yes.
And he finds himself in the middle of 1848 in Europe, in Italy and other places, and about the most exciting time you could possibly be if you're on the liberal side of the question. But then, yes, he comes back via America, I think, and then comes back to London.
But doesn't last long at UCL. He's the warden of a hall. But I think that's an interesting aspect of their relationship, that Clough's poetry is insistently political.
Yeah.
It's very, very aware of the politics of the day. Amour de Voyage is set in 1849 in Rome when it was being attacked by the French, and the character Claude sees a dead man. So whereas Arnold was drawn as the scholar gypsy, which is in dialogue with Thyrsis in many ways, and we'll come on to that, has a vision of poetry as somehow more rooted in an English romantic pastoral tradition, which he believes can be revivified with a kind of classical. There's more classicism in Arnold than there is in Wordsworth or Coleridge. Is that not the case?
I think that is true. I mean, he does like writing about classical subjects, for example. A very long poem he writes called Empedocles on Etna is the poem that prompts Clough to make that remark about, you should be writing poems for a generation that likes fiction, likes novels. Anyway, so Clough tours around Europe in increasingly failing health. He's had a stint in the 1850s working in the Department of Education, where, of course, Arnold also works as a school inspector. But by the early 1860s, his health really is failing. He just seems to have worked himself out, doesn't he, in some ways? Yes, and he dies in Florence in November 1861.
Yes. He was married by this time as well, and he worked as well with Florence Nightingale, didn't he? He was kind of secretary to Florence Nightingale. And I think in both their careers, there's a commitment and a belief in poetry in the early flush of youth, which is captured so brilliantly in Thyrsis. And then there's a sense in which the Victorian age simply can't sustain visionary poetry or even prosaic poetry, that only Tennyson gets away with it, or Browning gets away with it by being so kind of determined and great, that for slightly less driven poets than those two, Arnold and Clough, they are striking in that Arnold's poetry sort of peters out in his mid-40s, and Thyrsis, we should say, is one of the last of his kind of great poems, and he lives many decades after. But Thyrsis is not only an elegy for Clough, but partly an elegy by Arnold for his own failing poetic powers.
So after the news of the death comes through, Arnold decides to go to Oxford on his own the following Easter and to roam around the hills to the west of Oxford. And we'll talk a little bit about the landscape in the poem in a moment. And he writes a letter where he's describing what he's doing. And it's very striking, I think, where he wants to walk where we have so often rambled. It's a poem about the Cumnor hillside and Clough in connection with it. So exactly not the priority that you'd think it would be. You'd think it would be about Clough and drawing on the Oxfordshire countryside, but Arnold kind of reverses that hierarchy in an interesting way.
Landscape has been prominent in quite a lot of these elegies we've looked at. In Memoriam has lots of landscape poems which are infused with the loss of Arthur and so on. But Arnold takes it to a new extreme. And then Auden takes it one extreme further, because that again is a landscape poem, but it's an urban landscape poem. But they primarily depict the loss of the poet that they are commemorating through landscape. That is something that they have in common. And to an extent, I think Arnold is celebrating or commemorating the youthful promise they had when they were both students at Oxford, though, Clough had already graduated by the time Arnold arrived, but they knew each other at Oxford and obviously shared a lot of excitement, not only at the countryside, but at poetry. And this is a poem of friendship, although what it says about Clough is not particularly admiring, and it could be seen as, in that sense, quite honest, if a little bit libelous, admirers of Clough might argue.
Arnold himself, we'll get onto the poem itself next, but Arnold himself describes it in another letter as a very quiet poem, but I think solid and sincere. One has the feeling, if one reads the poem as a memorial poem, that not enough is said about Clough in it.
Yes.
Which is rather a brilliant kind of admission, isn't it, for an elegy?
Yes. I think it comes out of the vexed relationship, and that is mapped onto the kind of concept of the poem with Thyrsis and Corydon.
Yeah.
So Thyrsis and Corydon were kind of rivals in Virgil's eclogues. So to an extent, I think what's happening is a kind of dramatization of poetic rivalry and poetic conflict, that they had different visions of what poetry should be like. And that, Arnold survives and gets to write a poem about Clough, which presents him as somehow racked with scepticism, as unable to adjust to the troubles of life, as somehow having too much conscience to cope with the rough and tumble of mid-century Victorian kind of commercial life, none of which is true, although Clough's sources of income were fairly uncertain throughout his life. But this is a figuration of Clough as somehow Arnold's antagonist or his opposite in some ways.
And brother at the same time.
As well as his brother, yeah.
Okay, well, let's look at the first few lines, shall we? It always strikes me as being so interesting because so many of the references in these opening lines are things that feel almost absolutely private to Arnold and Clough and their circle. So the poem was first published in a volume called New Poems in 1867. And by this time, Arnold is a very, very well-known poet. He's being read not just all over Britain, but also in North America. And he must have known that lots of the references that he just drops casually into these opening lines would be completely mysterious to a lot of his readership who had no familiarity with Oxford. Let me just read the first few lines. How changed is here each spot man makes or fills. In the two Hinkseys nothing keeps the same. The village street its haunted mansion lacks, and from the sign is gone Sibella's name, and from the roofs the twisted chimney stacks. Are ye too changed, ye hills? See, 'tis no foot of unfamiliar men tonight from Oxford up your pathway strays. Here came I often, often in old days, Thyrsis and I. We still had Thyrsis then. Now, if you're reading this in Boston, you'd say, what the hell are the Hinkseys? Now, you and I know that there's two little tiny villages just to the west of Oxford called North Hinksey and South Hinksey. North Hinksey had a haunted house, and South Hinksey had a pub run by a woman called Sibella. So all that is actually documentarily true. But it's an interesting effect, isn't it, for a readership that's not part of this coterie?
Yes, particularly when it's in dialogue with the title, which so advertises its Milton's Lycidas.
Yes.
Thyrsis, a monody to commemorate the author's friend Arthur Hugh Clough, which completely is a reference to Lycidas, which Milton also called a monody. And that aims at the largest possible audience. It doesn't have these private references. I think this is a rather sort of touching look forward to confessional poetry. Lowell or kind of Berryman can drop in names of kind of random people or random events without kind of batting an eyelid. And Arnold seems to be writing a poetry of a similar kind of coterie nature, as did, to go on to our final poet, James Schuyler. Schuyler and Frank O'Hara both write a poetry which is completely awash with private references. So we could give Arnold perhaps a bit of credit here, although it may have baffled his original audience. But I think at the same time, he is feeling his way back into their early life together in Oxford and what it was like wandering around together, being these two brilliant, gifted young men and enjoying the countryside. And from a huge distance as well. It's a poem that's absolutely full of allusions to other poems, and one of them is Wordsworth's Immortality Ode, which is a poem which is about Wordsworth's sense of his losing visionary power, youthful imaginative motivation. And Arnold is presenting himself in very similar plight in lots of ways, but attempting to charge up the poetic batteries by getting back both to Oxford and to his early friendship with Clough that took place there.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast. Or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.